Hey guys, it's Grace here again, and today we're exactly halfway through our lesson series. We are on lesson 8, and we're going to be covering for and while loops. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so let's first kind of talk a bit about loops. So sometimes we want to do something many times. So for instance, I could maybe want to read in maybe 100 numbers, for instance. But it would be kind of be inefficient to create 100 variables and then read in a value for every single one of them. And so what I want is to kind of compact this in a repeatable step. So our solution to that is loops. Now, let's first talk about for loops. So here I am showing the syntax for a for loop. So we're going to be using the for keyword. And then inside parentheses, we have 3 important steps separated by semicolons. So first we have the initialization, and then we have a condition, and then an iteration. And then, of course, we're going to enclose the body of the statement in double braces. So below, I have an example of a for loop. So in this for loop, my initialization is integer I equals 0. And then my condition, which is basically the condition that this loop is going to run under, is I less than 5. So once I reaches exactly 5, this loop is going to terminate and it's not going to run anymore. And then finally, we have the iteration, which here is just an increment. So I'm just adding 1 to I, and I denote that by I plus plus. Then for the body of my statement, you can do whatever you want. Here, I'm just printing out I on a new line. So we kind of reviewed the code together. So let's run this and see what sort of output we get. So if you haven't already, log into Replit. We're going to create a new program. Okay, so let's kind of see if we can write this for loop by memory. So we have the for keyword, and then we have parentheses. And in these parentheses, we need 3 steps, right? First step is the initialization. So I'm going to declare some variable, which we usually call I. And then we need the condition so that this for loop knows when to run and then when to stop. And my condition is I less than 5. And then we need iteration. So we have to update the variable I, and we're just going to increment it by 1. Okay, and then we have double braces, and then this is the body of our statement. We're going to do something in here. And in this case, I'm just printing out the current value of I. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this, and let's see what we get. All right, so let's take a look at our output here. So in our first line, we have 0. In our second line, we have 1, and then we have 2, 3, and 4. So here we have 5 lines, which is exactly how many times this for loop runs. It runs for the values from I equals 0 to I equals 4. That's exactly 5 values. And in each iteration of our for loop, we're printing out the current value of I. So how our for loop starts is at I equals 0. So yeah, that's our first line of output. And then when this runs again, I will have updated by 1. So it's going to be 1. And that is in the next line in our output. And then we updated it by adding 1 to it once again. Then I is going to be 2 at this point. And that's our third line of output. And then so on. We get 3, and 4. And then in the next step, when we increment I, we'll get 5. However, if I is 5, this doesn't satisfy our condition. So that's why our program stops there and we're done. We don't print out any more values. Okay, now we've kind of learned the basics of for loops. Then let's get some practice to better understand how to use them. So for our first exercise, let's write a for loop that prints out numbers from 1 to n. So n is going to be an integer given by the user. So now here we're going to want to set up our scanner so we can read in the integer n. Okay, so now I have my number n, and what I want to do is print out numbers from 1 to n. So then let's think about it. The first number I'd want to print out in my for loop is 1, not 0, like the example we saw previously. So when we do our initialization, it's going to be a little bit different. So this variable I'm going to initialize it at 1 because that's the first value I want to print out in this loop. And then for my condition, I want the last number I print out to be exactly n. So no, my condition's not going to be I less than n. It's going to be I less than or equal to n. Because we still want this loop to run if I is exactly equal to n, right? We still want to print out the value of I when it's equal to n. And then my iteration is the same. I'm going to increment I just by 1. And now within my for loop, I'm just going to print out the current value of I. And this is pretty similar to the first example that I showed you guys. It only has slight modifications. All right, so now I'm going to let n be 5. And this is what I get for my output. So in my first line, I get 1. In my second line, I get 2. And then you can see it goes all the way to 5, which is exactly what we want. We want numbers from 1 to 5. Okay, now let's make this a little more complicated. Now we're going to write a for loop that calculates the average of n given numbers. Okay, so first things first, I still want a variable to store n, which is user given. Okay, but now I want to calculate the average, so I need some extra steps. And in case you don't know, the average in this case would be the sum of these n numbers divided by n. So what I want to do first is calculate the sum. So I'm going to store this sum in an integer variable and initialize its value to 0. Okay, now I want to read in exactly n numbers. So now I'm going to use a for loop to do this. And this for loop should run exactly n times. So I is going to start at 0, and it's going to run as long as I is less than n, and we're going to increment I by 1 each time. Now within the for loop, I want to get some integer number from the user as input. So I'm going to store this in a variable. I'm just going to call it a, and then I'm going to read its value in. Okay, so good. Now I have a for loop that reads in n integers, but as I'm doing this, I want to update my sum. So I'm going to add the value of a to my sum. Okay, so at this point, we have calculated the sum of the given n numbers. Okay, our next step is calculating their average. So now we're going to create a variable to store this average. And this is going to be a double type because the sum might not necessarily exactly divide n. And with integer division, we might not get an exact answer. So the double gives us more precision. And the value of this average is just going to be the sum divided by n. Now here, we still want to typecast the sum so that we avoid the possible errors that come with integer division. Okay, and now we can print out the average. And here I'm going to prompt the user as they read an input since we're reading in more numbers and it may be a little confusing. Okay, so my first prompt, enter how many integers you want. And then within my for loop, as I read in each number, I'm going to just prompt enter an integer. Okay, so now we've cleaned things up a bit and let's run this. So let's say I want 5 integers. So my first one, let's just go with 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay, and so for my output, I get the average is 3.0, or you can just think of it as 3, and you can verify the math for yourself pretty easily, and that is correct. Let's try another test. So 7 numbers, I'm just going to enter random numbers this time. Okay, so now for my average, I should expect 4 plus 3 plus 7 plus 5 plus 1 plus 0 plus 2 divided by 7. And that should give me 22 divided by 7. So I get 3.142857, so on. You can quickly check 22 divided by 7. So yes, this is correct, and our program runs perfectly. Okay, so now we've talked about for loops. Let's talk about another kind of loop. So this is the while loop. And so its components are very similar to the for loop, except they're kind of in different places. So let's take a look at the syntax. So here we're going to do the initialization first, and this is outside the while loop itself. And so then I use the while keyword, and then within parentheses, I only have the condition. That is all. Now I also use a pair of braces, and then in the body of my statement, I can do whatever I want. However, I gotta make sure that I update the variable that I initialized previously up here. If I don't do that, this loop is gonna run forever. So here's an example. In this case, I have the integer I, and I initialize its value to 0. And so this while loop is going to run as long as I is less than 5. And then inside this while loop, I'm printing out the value of I, and then I make sure to update I by simply incrementing it, and I am done. So let's go to Replit and add this to our own program and test it out. So I'm doing my initialization outside the while loop. And this is my condition, I less than 5. And then inside my while loop, I'm printing out the value of I. And then let's not forget the most important step is that we need to update I. Okay, so now we can run this. And this is what we get. It's the exact same output as the for loop example. So in the first line, we have 0, and the second line, we have 1, then 2, 3, 4, and so on. Okay, so now let's take away this I++ here, and then let's see what happens. Let's see why it is so important. So I'm running this program, and look what I keep getting. I get so many zeros, and as you can see, it's not ending. So I've got to stop this here. All right, so when I'm not updating I is going to be stuck at 0 forever. So let's say we're at the first iteration of our for loop. I is 0, so it satisfies this condition. Then we print out I, which is 0. Okay, then we go to the next iteration. I is still 0, it still satisfies this condition, and we still print out the same value, and this goes on and on and on until we don't stop. We have to stop this program ourselves. So yeah, a very common mistake when you're writing a while loop is not updating this variable, and you have to be very careful about that. So that's one slight inconvenience with writing a while loop. All right, so now let's practice a bit with writing while loops. So here we want to write a while loop that prints out numbers from 1 to n. Okay, so same thing here. I want to read in an integer n. And then I'm initializing I outside the while loop. So I am going to initialize at 1. And now for the condition of my while loop, I want I to be less than or equal to n. Inside my while loop, I'm printing out the value of I. And then I have to be very careful and make sure that I'm updating I. Okay, so that should be simple enough. Now let's just run this and test it. So if n equals 5, this is my output. All right, so now let's write a while loop that calculates the factorial of n. So in case you don't know, when I want the factorial of n, which is denoted by an exclamation mark, by the way, this is equivalent to saying I want the product of numbers from 1 to n. So n factorial will look like 1 times 2 times 3, all the way until I reach n. Okay. So first things first, I want to read in n, and then I'm going to want a variable to store the factorial of n. And here I'm going to initialize it to 1 rather than 0. Because think about it this way. Factorial of n, we're going to be constantly updating it by multiplying it by some number. So if I start it at 0 and I multiply it by some number, the value is still going to be 0 and it's not going to change at all. So in the end, our output will give us the totally wrong thing. Now, if I initialize it at 1, then the value will update and I'm going to get the correct output. Okay, so now I'm going to write my while loop. So I do my initialization. I starts at 1, and we're going to be multiplying the factorial of n variable by I. And I has to be less than or equal to n. Okay, so now I want to update my variable in line 7. So I'm multiplying it by the value of I. Okay, we're not quite done yet. We still have to update I. Okay, now we're done with our while statement. And then we can print out our output. So we say the factorial of n. Let's plug in the value that we got. So the factorial of n is the value that we calculated. All right, let's run this now and then let's test it. Okay, now let's say n is 5. And if we calculate this really quickly, then we should get 120. Okay, and so for our output, we get the factorial of 5 is 120, and that is correct. Let's try a slightly bigger number. For example, we can try 7, and this gives us the factorial of 7 is 5040, which is also correct. Okay, now let's write a while loop that adds the sum of only positive numbers, and so this program should stop once it reads in -1. So here is an example. So let's say for my input, I have the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then -1. So what this program should do is calculate the sum of these. And then once we reach -1, this program is going to stop and we're just going to print out the sum. All right. So the first thing we want to do here is let's think about what sort of condition this while loop will run on. So a condition might be something like this. So while the number we read in is not -1, we're gonna add that number to the sum, right? Okay, so by doing this, we already have our condition, actually. So the number we read in cannot be -1. So now let's write that while loop. So I'm gonna keep an integer variable n that's gonna store the current number I'm reading in. And so my while loop is basically going to run while n is not equal to -1, right? So for my condition, it will be this. N not equal to -1. And when we're saying not equals to in Java, we use the exclamation mark followed by the equal sign. Okay, so now while n is not equal to -1, then I'm going to update my sum. So out here, let me keep another integer variable to store the sum of all these numbers. Okay, then back in the while loop, I will update sum by adding the value of n to it. All right, then after I do that, I want to update n still, right? Because this is the variable I'm using in my condition. If I don't update it, it's going to be stuck in this while loop forever and it's going to run infinitely since n equals 0 will always satisfy this for loop. So then how am I going to update n? I'm going to update n by assigning a new value to it, which is the next number that I read in. Okay, and we're done. There we go. So let's print our output. So the sum of these numbers is the sum. All right, so now let's run this and test our program. All right, so I'm just going to keep entering in numbers because in this case, we aren't asking for how many numbers we want. So 6, 7, 8, 9, 2, and now a -1. So what am I getting for my output? My output says the sum of these numbers is 52. So let's take a look at this. 6 plus 7, 13, 21, 30, 32, 36, 43, and finally 52. And we don't do anything once you reach -1. We just terminate the while loop and we stop and we print out the output. Okay, let's try something else. So what if I stick -1 in the middle of my input, for instance? Then what am I getting? So here I get the sum of these numbers is 24. So let's take a look at this. 3, we start with 3, then 8, then 15, 24. we hit -1, stop. We're not going to look at these numbers at all. Okay, so our program is able to run successfully. Now let's move on to the next thing. So here, let's kind of extend the concept of loops to nested loops. So what nested loops basically are just a loop inside a loop. So like a double loop, for instance. You could also have triple loops, quadruple loops, as many loops as you want inside of each other. So for instance, let's take a look at a nested for loop first. So you can see the syntax is the same, nothing changed. It's just we have another for loop inside of our outer one. So our outer for loop initialization is int I equals 0. The condition I is less than 5. And then the iteration, we increment I by 1. Okay, now within our double braces, we're inserting another for loop in here. So here, you want to be very careful to use a different variable name, else Java is going to get confused. So then we usually call this one J. So I, J, alphabetical order. So here int J equals 0, J is less than 5, J plus plus, and inside my J for loop, my inner for loop, I'm printing out this asterisk symbol. Then outside my inner for loop, but still inside my outer for loop, I'm printing out a new line. And so you might be kind of thinking, what does this give me? Now let's try and run this ourselves and let's see. I find that a thing with nested for loops is that it's a lot easier to understand if you see it visually, and it's very easy to do that. So okay, so here I'm just copying the code from these slides, and it looks like this. So now let's run this. Okay, and this is what we get. We get 5 rows of asterisks with 5 columns as well. So it's basically a 5 by 5 square of asterisks. Now, how does this relate to the code? So our outer for loop here, you can kind of think of as the rows. So I is the row we are at. So when I is 0, this is the corresponding row. So when I is 0, then we're going to go to the inner for loop. And then this inner for loop runs 5 times. So that's why we print out exactly 5 asterisks in each row, as you can see. So J, our inner for loop, is kind of like the number of columns. So think of it as rows by columns. And then in our second row, we have the same thing. I will be 1, then J is going to run from 0 to 4. So we get a row of 5 asterisks. And so on until we get exactly 5 rows. Okay, so then now let's talk about a nested while loop. So it looks a bit more complicated, and once again, that's because of how a while loop is kind of written. It requires a bit more lines of code than a for loop. So here, my initialization goes outside my outer while loop. So I is going to be 0. And then for my condition, I less than 5, this is the same. And then within my double braces, I'm going to insert my inner while loop. So here I do the initialization of J outside the inner while loop. So J equals 0. And then this while loop is going to run while J is less than 5. Sorry for the typo. And then in my inner while loop, I'm printing out this symbol and I'm making sure to increment j. Okay, so once I'm done with the inner while loop, I'm printing out a new line. And then let's not forget, we have to update I. Ooh, okay, so that was quite a bit. Now let's try and run this in our own program. So I initialize at 0. I has to be less than 5. Now for my inner while loop, j is going to be 0. It will run as long as j is less than 5. And then inside my inner while loop, I'm going to print out an asterisk. And I'm going to update j. And then outside my inner while loop, I'm printing out a new line. And then I'm going to update I. And I am done. Now let's run this. So as expected, we get the same output, which is a 5 by 5 square of asterisks. So our first row was kind of the first iteration of our while loop when I is 0. And then each asterisk is printed out when j goes from 0 to 4. And then I print out a new line. And then I start again where I equals 1. And so on until I equals 4. All right, so thank you so much for watching this lesson, and I will see you guys next time.